reform bill into law.
With the stroke of a presidential pen, the new financial regulatory reform law is aimed at curbing the excesses on Wall Street while protecting average Americans who live and work on Main Street.
All told, these reforms represent the strongest consumer financial protections in history.
Wall Street reform, a landmark rolling back of financial deregulation that led this nation into the financial catastrophe that we experienced at the end of the Bush administration and the deepest recession in nearly a century. Historic headline-grabbing achievements like that ultimately overshadowed lots of other major agenda items of the last 2 years. Quote, the 111th Congress may be remembered for banner legislation such as health care reform, financial regulation, and the Recovery Act. But in our view, the real successes were the passage of bills that affected nearly every veteran in America. That's the National Commander of the American Legion. President Obama and the Democrats in Congress did more for veterans in these last 21 months than has been done in a very long time. They approved the most funding ever for the Veterans Administration. They expanded VA access to veterans. They authorized additional assistance for caregivers of veterans and for female veterans. Over the last 21 months, Democrats passed 25 separate tax cuts. They passed the most significant land conservation bill in nearly 2 decades. They created a consumer financial protection agency. And, oh, by the way, they shrunk the federal deficit in the process. The Democratic Party has had control of the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives for the last 21 months. Forget the individual fights over the individual provisions of the individual bills. Forget the lost amendment fights and the process complaints. Democrats had a choice when they became the governing party, when they won those last 2 elections and they took control of the 2 branches of government that are subject to partisan control in our country. They could have governed in a way that was about accumulating political capital with a primary goal of winning the next election. They could have governed in constant campaign mode. Or they could have governed in a way that was about using their political capital, not accumulating more of it, about spending the political capital they had to get a legislative agenda done, to tackle big, complex, long-standing problems that had languished. The record of legislative achievement of the last 21 months was not designed to win the midterm elections, and it will not win the midterm elections. The pendulum will swing back toward the Republicans, and we will go back to divided government again. The legislative agenda of the last 21 months was policy, not politics. It was designed to get stuff done for the country. And in that sense, it's an investment in long-term political reward, not short-term political reward, as Democrats expect, after a list of accomplishments like this, to be judged as the party that took on problems when it had the chance, even if they had to pay a short-term political price. The political capital that Democrats accumulated over the last 2 elections was spent in this last 21 months. And it was spent on policy. Hard votes with long time horizons that don't translate into killing the other party in the next election. If you listen to the criticism, particularly from the left, heading into these elections, what you often hear is that Democrats are going to lose in these elections because they didn't get enough done. You know, big picture, if that were true, that would be depressing. It's not actually the true big picture, though. The fact is that Democrats got a lot done, a lot of hard stuff done on hard problems in a short amount of time. The price they may end up paying for that is losing a midterm election. Democrats' choice is whether or not it's worth it. Joining us now is NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss. Mr. Beschloss, it is good to see you again. Thanks very much for joining us tonight.
A pleasure, Rachel.
So tomorrow marks the unofficial end of the 111th Congress, plus or minus the lame duck period.
Right.
Whether you are for all of those accomplishments I just described or against them, historically, how does this Congress stack up in terms of its legislative achievements?
Well, dealt with very basic issues, as you've just said. And, you know, it reminded me as you were talking, Rachel, you remember early in 2008, Barack Obama was in Nevada campaigning. I think he was talking to an editorial board, and he said, I want to be a transformational president, deal with basic issues like Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan of the conservatives. He was criticized a lot, but the point he was making was, in a way, just what you've said, which is, I want to be a president who uses this moment that may not come again of a party dominating both houses of Congress and also the White House to deal with basic things, not things that might get me reelected or help us win the next midterm election.
Is there, on the issue of sort of long-term political capital versus short-term political capital, is there any reason to think of this president as one who is investing in the long-term image, the long-term impression that Americans have of the Democratic Party as a party that is serious about policy issues? Certainly, we've seen him trade away short-term political capital for taking on some of these hard legislative fights. But is there reason to believe that doing that pays off in the long run in terms of the way people see the parties?
Well, one example would be health care. I mean, Barack Obama could very well have come into the White House and said, you know, I can't deal with health care right now. We've got an economic crisis. It did more than almost anything else to ruin Bill Clinton in the 1994 elections and has been very bad for presidents. But the point is that Obama did it, even though his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, begged him not to do it. That shows what kind of a person he is. So I think what he's saying is, you know, it may not be popular at the moment, but the Democratic Party does have to stand for something. And over the long run, that makes a party strong.
In all likelihood, we're going to be returning to divided government in this country when the next Congress is sworn in. Republicans will likely take control of the House, and they're trying for the Senate. In terms of big landmark achievements throughout American history, in terms of big policy achievements, do those things usually happen when Congress is divided, or are they more often the result of one party having at least temporary control of both the executive branch and the legislative branch?
It's almost always when the White House is of the same party as the Congress. Look at 1965. Lyndon Johnson came in. If you can believe it, Rachel, 2/3 of the Senate was Democrats, 2/3 of the House was Democrats. But even despite that, LBJ said, this doesn't happen very often. I've got 6 months. He used those 6 months to get through the Great Society, Medicare, voting rights, very basic programs. And he said, after that, they're going to start voting against me, and there will be a backlash. He was absolutely right. The Democrats had huge setbacks in Congress in 1966, but LBJ and the Great Society had probably more of an influence on Americans in terms of saying where the Democratic Party is, for well or ill, than perhaps any other president of the period.
And so when it comes to selling legislative accomplishment, of course, LBJ is an incredibly relevant precedent, because
a communicator he wasn't.
A communicator that he was, and he has this incredibly accomplished legislative record when you're talking about that period that you're talking about there. But ultimately, he gets turfed out and ends up ending his presidency the way he does, mostly because of Vietnam, right?
Right, that's exactly right. And what you want, and this is true with LBJ and Barack Obama, you want a president who does courageous things, and I think you've stated them, but you also want a president who's able to persuade his contemporaries, those of his own generation who have to vote in these elections, that this was the right thing to do. He can't just wait for history to say it was the right thing to do. In politics, you have to really convince the people who are passing on you at the time.
NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss, from whom I always learn a ton every time you're on the show. Thank you so much for your time tonight,
Thank you,
Michael.
Rachel.